476 AD. A teenage barbarian chieftain walks into the throne room of the last Roman emperor in the West. The emperor's name is Romulus Augustulus. A cruel historical irony that the last emperor shares his name with both the founder of Rome and the first emperor who built everything that is now ending. The barbarian chieftain Odoacer tells him he is no longer emperor. He is not killed. He is simply sent away to a comfortable villa in southern Italy with a pension. And with that quiet, undramatic conversation, the Roman Empire in the West is over. No final battle. No heroic last stand. No dramatic moment worthy of the 1,000 years that preceded it. Just a teenager telling an emperor to go home. But here is what nobody tells you. Rome did not fall in 476 AD. Rome had been falling for 200 years. And the reasons it fell will make you deeply uncomfortable about the world we live in right now. Before we talk about how Rome fell, we need to establish something important. The question of why Rome fell is not a simple question with a simple answer. Edward Gibbon, the 18th century historian who wrote the most famous account of Rome's decline, spent 6 volumes and several thousand pages on the question and still did not fully resolve it. Modern historians have proposed dozens of competing explanations. Military overextension, economic collapse, political instability, climate change, pandemic, lead, poisoning Christianity, the migration of peoples from Central Asia. Every one of these explanations contains genuine historical truth. Every one of them is also incomplete on its own. What actually destroyed Rome was not one thing. It was everything simultaneously. An understanding that is the beginning of understanding the most important historical question in Western civilization. We need to start with a geographical and chronological clarification that fundamentally changes how you understand the fall of Rome. The Roman Empire did not fall all at once. The western half, Italy, Gaul, Britain, Spain, North Africa, collapsed between approximately 376 and 476 AD. The eastern half, Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, Syria, did not fall at all in 476 AD. It continued as the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years until Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 AD. So when we talk about the fall of Rome, we are really talking about the fall of the Western Roman Empire specifically. And the Eastern Empire's survival for another millennium tells us something important. The problems that destroyed the West were not inevitable features of Roman civilization as a whole, but specific vulnerabilities that the West had and the East managed differently. The story of Rome's fall does not begin in 476 AD. It begins 2 centuries earlier with what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, the period between 235 and 284 AD when the Roman Empire came closer to complete dissolution than at any point before its actual fall. In 50 years, Rome had approximately 50 emperors. Most of them were military commanders who seized power by force and were then killed by the next man who wanted the throne. The average reign was less than 2 years. Several emperors lasted less than a year. At least one lasted less than a month. The consequences of this political chaos were catastrophic and cumulative. The military that had been the foundation of Roman power was consuming itself. Legions fighting legions, resources that should have been defending the borders being spent on civil wars, the loyalty of soldiers transferring from the Roman state to individual commanders who paid them and led them to victory. The borders that had been maintained with relative stability for 2 centuries were breached repeatedly as the internal chaos distracted Roman military attention from external threats. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube. Persian forces under the Sassanid dynasty, which had replaced the Parthians as Rome's great eastern rival, invaded Roman territory and in 260 AD achieved something that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. They captured a Roman emperor in battle. Valerian, the senior Augustus of the empire, was taken prisoner by the Persian king Shapur I and spent the rest of his life in captivity. A Roman emperor was a Persian prisoner. The psychological impact across the empire was enormous. The economic consequences of the crisis were equally devastating. The constant civil wars required constant military spending. To fund that spending, the government debased the currency. reducing the silver content of coins so more coins could be minted from the same amount of silver. The result was inflation that ancient sources describe in terms that sound remarkably familiar. Prices rising faster than wages, savings becoming worthless, trade becoming difficult as merchants refused to accept coins whose value was uncertain. The economic infrastructure that had made the Roman world wealthy and interconnected was deteriorating in ways that would prove very difficult to reverse. Diocletian stabilized the crisis of the 3rd century through administrative reforms that were genuinely brilliant and genuinely authoritarian simultaneously. He divided the empire between 4 rulers. He reorganized the provinces into smaller units with more administrators. He tried to control inflation through price-fixing edicts. The Edict on Maximum Prices, a document that survives today and gives us extraordinary detail about the Roman economy of the late 3rd century. He reorganized the military. He persecuted Christians with a systematic thoroughness that earlier persecutions had not matched. And then in 305 AD, he retired voluntarily to his palace in Split on the Adriatic coast, which still stands today, one of the best preserved Roman buildings in the world, and grew cabbages. The only Roman emperor who ever chose to stop. The military transformation that occurred during the 3rd and 4th centuries was one of the most significant structural changes in Roman history and one of the most important contributors to the Western Empire's eventual collapse. The Roman legions that had conquered the Mediterranean world and maintained Roman borders for centuries were composed primarily of Roman citizens, men with a stake in Roman civilization who fought because they were defending something that was genuinely theirs. By the 4th century, the composition of the Roman military had changed fundamentally. The legions were increasingly filled with Germanic barbarian recruits, foederati, allied barbarian units fighting under their own commanders for Roman pay, and individual barbarian soldiers recruited directly into Roman units in numbers that changed the character of the military from within. This was not inherently catastrophic. Barbarian soldiers could be and often were excellent fighters genuinely loyal to Rome and its interests. Many of the most effective Roman commanders of the late Empire had Germanic names and barbarian origins. The problem was structural rather than racial or ethnic. It was the question of what these soldiers were fighting for and how their loyalty was maintained. Roman citizen soldiers had fought for Rome because Rome was their civilization, their home, their identity. Barbarian foederati fought for pay for land grants for the specific commander who had recruited them. When that pay was not forthcoming, or when the commander they followed made a different calculation about where their interests lay, the loyalty that Roman military effectiveness depended on became unreliable in ways that citizen legions had not been. The cost of maintaining this military was also becoming unsustainable. The late Roman army was larger than the army of the early empire. More soldiers covering more frontier with more equipment. And the economic base that had to support it was simultaneously contracting due to the plague, economic disruption, and the loss of productive agricultural territory to barbarian raids and settlement. The empire was trying to maintain a 4th century military on an increasingly 3rd century economy. The gap between military requirement and economic capacity was one of the fundamental dynamics driving the collapse. The specific event that modern historians most often identify as the beginning of the end was the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. A large force of Visigoths, a Germanic people who had been allowed to settle inside Roman borders as refugees fleeing the Huns from Central Asia, revolted against Roman mistreatment and corrupt administration. The Emperor Valens led the Eastern Roman army against them and was decisively defeated. Valens himself was killed in the battle, one of the very few Roman emperors to die fighting an external enemy on Roman soil. The Visigoths were not expelled from Roman territory after their victory. They could not be expelled. The military capacity to do so no longer existed. They were instead settled permanently inside the empire on terms they largely dictated. The border between Rome and the barbarian world had moved permanently inward. The economic deterioration that accompanied and accelerated Rome's military decline is in many ways the most important and least dramatic part of the story. It is less cinematic than barbarian invasions or mad emperors, but it was more fundamentally destructive because it undermined the material foundation that everything else depended on. The Roman economy at its height in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD was one of the most sophisticated pre-industrial economic systems in human history. Integrated trade networks spanning the entire Mediterranean world, agricultural surpluses supporting urban populations of unprecedented size, specialized manufacturing producing goods that moved across thousands of miles of road and sea routes, a monetary system that facilitated exchange across an enormous geographical area. By the 4th century, this system was fragmenting in ways that had profound practical consequences. The currency debasement of the 3rd century had destroyed trust in the monetary system. People reverted to barter and payment in kind. Tax collection shifted from money to goods. The monetized economy that had allowed Roman cities to grow and specialize contracted back toward local subsistence agriculture. Trade networks that had connected Britain to Egypt contracted as the security and infrastructure that made long-distance trade possible deteriorated. Cities that had grown large on the basis of trade and specialized production shrank as the economic basis for that specialization disappeared. The tax base shrank as the economy contracted, but military and administrative costs remained high or increased as external pressures grew. The gap was filled by increasing the tax burden on those who remained, particularly the small farmers and artisans who could not escape taxation the way wealthy landowners could through political connections and legal manipulation. The increasing tax burden drove small farmers off their land, either into debt bondage to large landowners or into simple abandonment of their farms and flight to cities or barbarian territory. The large landowners who absorbed their land became increasingly powerful local figures whose private resources and private armed retinues made them effectively independent of the imperial government. The centralized Roman state was hollowing out from within as economic power concentrated in private hands. The plague is a factor that modern historians have increasingly recognized as more important than older accounts acknowledged. The Antonine Plague of the 2nd century, which we discussed in the Marcus Aurelius video, killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people and fundamentally disrupted the demographic and economic patterns of the empire. The plague of Cyprian in the mid-3rd century was even more severe. Ancient sources describe mortality rates in some areas that suggest losses comparable to the Black Death 1,000 years later. Repeated pandemic events reduced the population available for military service, agricultural production, and tax payment, while simultaneously disrupting the trade networks and urban systems that generated economic surplus. A civilization under sustained demographic pressure from repeated pandemic cannot maintain the same military and administrative commitments that it could sustain at full population. Rome could not and did not. The political dysfunction of the late Roman Empire was both a cause and a consequence of the military and economic problems, a feedback loop in which political instability made the other problems worse, while the other problems made political stability harder to achieve. The fundamental political problem was the one that Augustus had embedded in the imperial system when he designed it. There was no legitimate constitutional mechanism for transferring power. Every imperial succession was potentially a crisis because the identity of the next emperor was never legally established in advance in a binding way. The result was that every death of an emperor was potentially the beginning of a civil war as competing claimants, usually military commanders with loyal armies, fought to determine who would succeed. The Western Empire in its final century had emperors who lasted months or even weeks before being killed by rivals or their own soldiers. The administrative continuity that effective government requires, the ability to implement policies over years and decades, to maintain consistent relationships with provincial administrators and military commanders, to plan and execute long-term projects, was impossible in a political environment where the government's head changed with this frequency. Every new emperor brought new favorites, new priorities, new enemies of the previous regime who needed to be dealt with. The administrative class that was supposed to implement policy spent as much energy managing political transitions as actually governing. The division of the empire between western and eastern halves, formalized after Constantine and permanent after the death of Theodosius in 395 AD, created additional coordination problems that the Western Empire was less well positioned to manage than the East. The East was wealthier, more urbanized, more economically sophisticated, and governed from Constantinople, a city that Constantine had deliberately designed for defensibility and that controlled the strategic choke point between Europe and Asia. The West was poorer, more rural, more exposed to barbarian pressure on its long Rhine and Danube frontiers, and governed from a succession of capitals, Milan, Ravenna, that reflected the military priorities of emperors who spent more time on campaign than in Rome itself. Rome itself, the city, had already ceased to be the real center of imperial power long before 476 AD. The last emperor to actually govern effectively from Rome was probably Constantine himself in the early 4th century before he moved to Constantinople. After that, the practical center of Western imperial government moved to wherever the emperor happened to be, usually closer to the military frontiers where the actual threats were. Rome became increasingly a symbolic city, the name that the empire carried and the monument that justified the claim to civilizational continuity, rather than a functioning administrative capital. When Alaric the Visigoth sacked Rome in 410 AD, the psychological impact was enormous precisely because of what Rome symbolized. The practical impact was more limited. The city was looted but not destroyed, and the imperial government continued from Ravenna. The final act of the Western Empire's collapse was not a dramatic military conquest, but a gradual administrative replacement. The Roman imperial government losing control of territory piece by piece as barbarian groups settled within the empire's borders and established their own governance structures that replaced rather than simply disrupted Roman administration. The Visigoths established a kingdom in southwestern Gaul and Spain. The Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa and established a kingdom that controlled the Western Mediterranean's most productive agricultural territory and most important grain supply. The Burgundians settled in the Rhone Valley. The Franks consolidated control of northern Gaul. The Angles and Saxons settled in Britain after the Roman legions withdrew in 410 AD and never returned. These barbarian kingdoms were not simply destructive replacements of Roman civilization. Many of their leaders were Romanized. They had served in the Roman military, they spoke Latin, they admired Roman law and Roman administrative practice, and tried to incorporate elements of it into their own governance. Theodoric the Ostrogoth, who ruled Italy from 493 to 526 AD, after the date conventionally identified as the fall of Rome, governed in many respects as a Roman emperor, maintained Roman administrative structures, patronized Roman culture, and employed Roman administrators of genuine capability, including the philosopher Boethius. The transition from Roman imperial governance to barbarian kingdom governance in the West was less a civilizational collapse than a political restructuring, genuinely devastating in many respects, but not the end of everything Roman. What did end was the political unity of the Western Mediterranean world under a single government. The tax base that had funded the military, that had maintained the roads, the aqueducts, the public buildings, the administrative machinery, that disappeared. Without centralized funding, the infrastructure that Roman civilization had built began to deteriorate. Roads went unrepaired. Aqueducts fell into disuse. Cities shrank. Trade networks contracted. The population declined. The sophisticated, specialized economy that had supported Roman civilization retracted toward local subsistence over generations. This was the real fall of Rome, not the moment Odoacer told Romulus Augustulus to go home, but the slow deterioration of the systems that had made Roman civilization possible. So why did Rome really fall? After everything we have covered, the military transformation, the economic deterioration, the political dysfunction, the plagues, the barbarian settlements, what is the essential answer? The most honest answer is that Rome fell because of a combination of structural vulnerabilities that accumulated over centuries and that compounded each other in ways that made recovery progressively more difficult until it became impossible. The political system Augustus had designed worked brilliantly when capable and lucky emperors occupied its center. It had no meaningful mechanism for managing the consequences when incapable or unlucky emperors occupied that same position. 2 centuries of good governance under the 5 good emperors built enormous resilience. 2 centuries of intermittent chaos following them consumed that resilience faster than it could be rebuilt. By the time genuinely capable rulers like Diocletian and Constantine tried to reverse the deterioration, they could slow it and redirect it, but not fundamentally reverse the structural dynamics that were driving it. The economic system that had made Roman civilization wealthy depended on the political stability and physical security that the military provided. When military effectiveness declined, economic deterioration followed. When economic deterioration reduced the tax base available for military spending, military effectiveness declined further. The feedback loop between military capacity and economic health was self-reinforcing in both directions, upward during the period of Roman expansion and downward during the period of contraction. The social transformation that produced the colony, the semi-free tenant farmers who replaced the free small farmers and enslaved agricultural workers of the early empire, reduced the economic dynamism and the civic engagement that had characterized Roman society at its height. A society of large landowners and dependent tenant farmers, with a shrinking middle class of independent property owners, was less capable of generating the surplus and the civic participation that Roman civilization required to function. None of these factors alone was sufficient to destroy Rome. Together compounding over generations, they created a situation in which the Western Empire no longer had the resources, the political coherence, or the military capacity to maintain itself against pressures that earlier Rome had managed without existential difficulty. The fall of Rome is not just ancient history. It is a story about what happens to civilizations that are not paying attention to the right things. And the uncomfortable truth that historians have noted for centuries, that the parallels between late Roman civilization and our own are numerous and specific, deserves to be stated directly rather than implied. Rome fell in part because its political system could not reliably produce good governance. It fell because the gap between wealthy and poor became so wide that the civic engagement that democracy and republican government require became impossible to sustain. It fell because military commitments exceeded the economic base available to fund them. It fell because repeated pandemics disrupted demographic and economic patterns that the system depended on. It fell because infrastructure investment declined as short-term financial pressures took priority over long-term maintenance. It fell because the institutions that had made it great gradually became shells of themselves, maintaining the forms of republican or imperial governance while losing the substance. None of this is to say that modern Western civilization is Rome or that collapse is inevitable or imminent. History does not repeat with that kind of mechanical precision. But the Roman example is the best documented case study we have of how a civilization that reached extraordinary heights of achievement and organization can decline, not suddenly and dramatically, but gradually and through the accumulation of manageable-seeming problems that compound faster than they are addressed. Romulus Augustulus went to his villa in southern Italy and lived there for years after Odoacer sent him away. He was not killed. He received his pension. The barbarian chieftain who ended the Western Roman Empire was not trying to destroy civilization. He was trying to govern it in the only way that remained available. What had been lost was not the people or even immediately the buildings and roads and aqueducts. What had been lost was the political and economic system that had built and maintained those things. That system had been deteriorating for 200 years before the teenager in the throne room delivered the final quiet verdict. Rome did not fall. It dissolved. And the world it left behind took 1,000 years to fully digest what it had lost.